Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be on a panel with such distinguished fellow panelists. What I'd like to do to begin is to dispel some of the gloom and doom which I think has pervaded our public discourse about Afghanistan, somewhat unfairly, I think, of late. There's been talk of comparisons. We heard one earlier to Vietnam. There have been comparisons to Iraq, to the Soviet disaster in Afghanistan. Well, let me tell you, I mean, I've been going to Iraq pretty regularly since 2003, and I just went to Afghanistan in February and March, touring much of RC East and RC South, Regional Command East and Regional Command South. And let me tell you, there's just no comparison between the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in Iraq. Yes, Afghanistan is getting worse, but let's keep it in perspective. I mean, for example, when I was visiting ISAF, the NATO headquarters in Kabul, I said, hey, how much indirect fire do you guys take around here? I mean, how many rockets, mortars, that kind of stuff. You know, in the green zone in Iraq, they were taking multiple indirect fire hits every day for years. I mean, they were having people die in the parking lot of the U.S. Embassy compound in the international zone in Baghdad. And so I asked the question of the folks at ISAF, you know, how many of these rockets do you get? And they said, well, we think there was one maybe back in August. We don't really remember. It's been so long, we can't really keep track. Kabul is actually a pretty darn safe city. So is Jalalabad. So are a lot of other major cities in Afghanistan. It's nothing like Baghdad became in 2006 and 2007. And this is not just, you know, anecdotal impressions of somebody who just visits for a week or two. I mean, if you look at the actual figures, you will see that violence in Afghanistan is certainly up year to year over the last several years, but it's still 1/16 the level of the violence in Iraq in 2006. That's 1/16. It is much, much lower. Now, I'm not saying that we're winning the war in the South. I'm not even necessarily saying that we're winning the war in the East, but let's keep all this in perspective. Certainly, if we could turn around the situation in Iraq, we can certainly turn around the situation in Afghanistan, especially because we enjoy some advantages there, some of which Steve Biddle alluded to, and I just want to emphasize a little bit. The fact is that in the last ABC-BBC poll that was conducted in Afghanistan a few months ago, the percentage of people saying that they wanted a return to Taliban rule was 4%. 4%, okay? That is very little support. That is a lot less support than groups like the Jaish al-Mahdi and al-Qaeda in Iraq had within their respective sectarian communities in Iraq at the height of the violence in Iraq. Very, very little support because, as Steve said, they've tried it. They don't like it. They don't want to be ruled by the Taliban. And yes, Hamid Karzai is becoming less popular, but the notion of a democratic, pluralistic system is still overwhelmingly preferred. And there is, I think, still tremendous openness on the part of the people of Afghanistan towards the international forces, towards the U.S. and others who are there to help them build the kind of government that they would like to see. Most of their frustration with us is because we have not been delivering on our promises. We are there to provide law and order, to further economic and political development, and we haven't been doing it. But that's a completely understandable objection on the part of the people of Afghanistan. They're not saying, we don't want you guys here. What they're essentially saying, as I understand it from talking to them and from reading the polls, is we want you here, but we want you to do a better job. And of course, we haven't been able to do a better job because we have not resourced Afghanistan anywhere close to adequately over the last several years. And there's some good reasons, some bad ones for that. But largely, the reason why the bad guys have been making, and I use the word bad guys, by the way, as a very precise figure of speech here. I want to, because you have to be careful, as Steve suggested, about simply talking about the Taliban, because it's a lot more than the Taliban. There's about 10 or 11 groups that we're having to deal with. So actually, bad guys is in some ways a lot more accurate than saying Taliban, which sounds kind of the reverse. But the bad guys have been able to make gains largely because we've abdicated from huge chunks of the countryside. I mean, we've actually increased our force levels in the last few months, but even now, we only have 38,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, as opposed to about 170,000 in Iraq at the height of the surge. Now, obviously, there's some other NATO troops, but most of them don't do anything. I mean, the joke in Afghanistan is that ISAF stands for I Saw Americans Fighting. And that's a little bit unfair because some of our allies do quite a bit, the Brits, Canadians, Australians, and a few others, but most of them just sit on their bases. So they're pretty much useless. in terms of the troops that actually do stuff, there aren't nearly enough of them. And there's also not nearly enough Afghan security forces. In Iraq today, there's over 500,000 in the Iraqi security forces. In Afghanistan today, there's about 150,000, about 80,000 in the Afghan army and about 70,000 in the Afghan National Police, most of whom, by the way, are useless. The Afghan army, however, is a good news story. They fight hard. They are not sectarian. They are a good institution. They are just way too small. And so when you look at Afghanistan based, and there's a lot of ratios which are thrown out there in terms of the right ratio of counterinsurgents per population, how many security forces do you need per civilian, and there's various figures you can talk about, some of which are in the counterinsurgency manual. But there is nobody who could possibly suggest we're anywhere close to the right ratio in Afghanistan, given the size of the population, which is larger than in Iraq. So clearly we need more resources. Well, the good news is we're going to get more resources. And there was a very difficult debate, which I wasn't sure how it was going to come out in the Obama administration, but it came out the right way. I mean, the debate was basically between what, if you want to use military lingo, would be called CT versus COIN, counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency. There were some folks in the administration led by Vice President Biden, who I think has been pretty well wrong about every major foreign policy issue that I'm familiar with. There were some folks within the administration led by Vice President Biden who argued for a very narrow, focused counterterrorism strategy, which basically means reducing our troop levels and just trying to pick off individual terrorists one by one using predators or special operations forces or what have you. Now, this sounds very seductive, and this was in fact similar to a proposal that was made by many about Iraq in 2007. The only problem is it doesn't work. It's a whack-a-mole strategy. You can't end a broad-based insurgency / terrorist group by picking off individual leaders. They tend to they just pick new leaders to replace the ones who were lost, and they become more dangerous than ever. And the problem is we've tried that repeatedly in both Afghanistan and Iraq and found that it's failed. I mean, you could pick off somebody like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, but that didn't end al-Qaeda in Iraq. The only thing that could end al-Qaeda in Iraq was a broad-based counterinsurgency strategy of getting troops off their major bases into the population centers, providing basic security, which would then give the people the confidence to turn against the terrorists and provide us the kind of information we needed to take the terrorists out from among the civilian population. That's the only thing that has ever, I think, consistently worked in putting down any kind of major insurgency, and that's certainly the case in Afghanistan. I think there's very little chance that a narrow-focused, long-range strike type of counterterrorism strategy could possibly succeed. And I think this would have been a real disaster if we'd gone down that road. But the good news is we didn't go down that road, thanks to, I think, the leadership provided by Dick Holbrooke and Secretary Clinton and General Petraeus and others. President Obama was brought around to what I think is essentially the right view of how to proceed, which is to focus on counterinsurgency and focus not only on killing individual terrorists, but on standing up the institutions of Afghan governance so that they can, in the long run, sustain themselves and stabilize their own territory. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing. Now, it may not be 100% obvious because I think some of the rhetoric that the President has used is a little bit misleading, because in some ways I would say that the COIN side got the policy, but the CT side got the rhetoric, because all of his rhetoric is basically focused on we are there to disrupt al-Qaeda. He didn't mention the words nation building, which is actually the way we're going to win this, is by standing up the institutions of Afghan society. And as some of the previous panelists have alluded to, there is not a huge al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. Now, I think we have to be there anyway because there are a lot of groups which are associated with al-Qaeda, the Haqqani Network, the Taliban, and various others. But it's not al-Qaeda per se, which, as we know, has a stronghold in Pakistan, not Afghanistan, so we're only indirectly going to affect them based on our operations in Afghanistan. And this is something that, Hamid Karzai actually, I think, complained about rightly on CNN this weekend, saying, it's a good strategy, but why does he keep talking about al-Qaeda in the context of Afghanistan? I think really the reason he does it is because that's kind of what he thinks is easy to sell to the American public. But I think in the long run we'd be better off if he were to level with us a little bit more and to say, we have these enemies that we have to fight. Not all of them are al-Qaeda. Most of them aren't, in fact. but they think like al-Qaeda, and it would be a disaster for us if they were to take over Afghanistan, almost as much of a disaster as if al-Qaeda were to take over. And in fact, they probably would let in al-Qaeda if they took over. But the way we're going to defeat them is not by picking off individual terrorists. The way we're going to defeat them is by creating broad-based security, focusing on Regional Command South and Regional Command East. And once we do that, then we will dry up the terrain for the terrorists. And I think it's very much doable for a lot of the reasons that Steve Biddle alluded to. Now, let me just focus very briefly, if I could, on some of the areas where I think we still have room for improvement. I think the overall strategy is headed in the right path. We're sending more resources. That's a good thing. What it's going to mean in the short run, unfortunately, is more casualties all around. We're going to see, unfortunately, more American servicemen killed and wounded. We're going to see more Afghans, including more Afghan civilians, killed or wounded. We're going to see a temporary spike in violence, as we did in Iraq in the summer of 2007. But I think just as in Iraq, if we stick with it, we will be able to then reduce those levels of violence and be able to bring some real stability that has been lacking in Afghanistan. But if we're going to do that successfully, I think there's some areas that we still need to concentrate on where I think we still have room for improvement. And let me just talk to you very briefly about some of those. The first thing that I would mention is the need for more Afghan security forces. And this was one of the areas where I was disappointed, one of the few areas where I was disappointed with President Obama's policy unveiling, because there was talk that he might commit to a higher level of maybe make 400,000 the goal for the Afghan National Security Forces. And he didn't do that. I mean, he talked about accelerating the current buildup, which will take the Afghan National Army from about 80,000 to about 160,000 or so. But that's not going to be adequate. It has to be much broader based than that. And I think we need to put in more resources and convince our NATO allies, because if they're not going to fight, at least they can send some money to support the development of a broader Afghan National Security Force. And it has to be really on the order of 400,000 to 500,000, as we've had in Iraq, in order to bring lasting security to a country with 30 million people. And it's going to cost money, but it's a lot cheaper than sending Western soldiers into harm's way. So we need to do that. I think we also need to send a few more U.S. troops, not a huge number. I think we're getting in the right ballpark right now for U.S. troop levels. But my concern is that, and there's not a map of Afghanistan here, but the U.S. troops, we're sending about 21,000. The bulk of those are going to flow into RC South, into Helmand and Kandahar, Uruzgan provinces. There's a real danger, though, that they may push some of the insurgents into the west, into Farah and Herat, some of those areas where there are not a lot of coalition troops right now. So I think we have to be able to clamp down on the west as well, probably send another 2 to 3 U.S. brigade combat teams into western Afghanistan over the course of the next year. Those are at the margins. Those are not huge differences, and I think we have the capacity to do that as we're drawing down in Iraq. I think one of the real issues we confront, though, is are we going to be able to use the troops as wisely as we can? And that's a real issue because, Steve alluded to the spaghetti type of wiring diagram under which NATO operates, and that's, kind of a generous description. I mean, as folks there will tell you, including NATO officers, they'll tell you, we couldn't make this more screwed up if we tried. I mean, the C2, the command and control, is horrible. There is not the kind of smoothly running team that we had in place in 2007 in Iraq, where you had General Petraeus as the commander of Multinational Forces Iraq, the broad-based theater command, General Odierno, the head of Multinational Corps Iraq, in charge of day-to-day operations, and then Ambassador Crocker in charge of the civilian side of the effort. That was a tremendous team, and a lot of the reason why we were able to utilize the surge forces effectively in Iraq. Now, unfortunately, in the case of Afghanistan, there is no corps-level command. General McKiernan, who was the U.S./NATO commander, has to do both the Petraeus and the Odierno roles while dealing with 41 countries, multiple international organizations, non-governmental organizations. It's a mess. It's more than any person could do. Even if he were, General Patton and General MacArthur wrapped into one, it's more than one person can handle. And he doesn't really have an adequate staff to do the job because he's got this NATO pickup team with officers rotating in and out of his headquarters on a 4 to 6 month basis. It's chaotic. There is no continuity. It is very hard to have an adequate campaign plan developed and then implemented. There are huge seams between regional commands. And even in the regional commands, there's not an adequate structure. For example, in RC South, there is a pickup team at the division headquarters with a Dutch general, British and American deputies, and officers from all nations. Now, I'm all for multinational cooperation, but you've got to have an effective team, and we haven't really been able to do that. So that needs to be addressed. We need a good corps-level staff in Iraq. We need good division staffs like the kind I think we have in RC East with the 101st Division being there, that those are big issues, and they involve dealing with the diplomatic complications of NATO. But I think we have to stop kowtowing to all 41 countries who are there and say, okay, we're going to accept the fact we might aggravate a few of these countries, but big deal. We'd rather win the war and aggravate a few allies than try to keep everybody happy and lose the war. And that's essentially, to some extent, the choice that we have to make for ourselves. I mean, one of the areas where the current structure is so screwed up is on the counter-narcotics element, because everybody knows that narcotics is a huge part of the problem. It's a huge chunk of the financing for the Taliban and other groups, but yet the NATO mandate does not allow NATO forces to engage in a counter-narcotics mission. And so as a result of that, you have the mission going on, but it is not well integrated with the rest of the campaign plan. And I was out there in Farah province or Kandahar talking to, this guy who's a real swashbuckler, white beard, white hair, these unusual camis, 45 strapped on his belt, former Special Forces trooper who's been in Afghanistan for 4 years, working as a contractor for the State Department, working as an advisor to the counter-narcotics forces. And he was telling us how they do it. They take, every morning, they go out with their tractors, 50 tractors, 1,000 guys, a little air cover, and they look for poppy fields to destroy. They go out there, they find some poppy fields, and they destroy them while they're taking incoming fire. Well, that's all right as far as it goes, but it's not an integrated counter-narcotics strategy. You've got to have that piece integrated with the rest of the campaign plan, which is very, very hard to do right now because of the limitations imposed by NATO. Another area where NATO limitations, I think, are very harmful is in the fact that troops operating under the ISAF mandate are only allowed to detain terrorist suspects for 96 hours. 96 hours, and they either got to let them go or turn them over to somebody else. But the Afghan justice system is dysfunctional, so who do you turn them over to? In a lot of cases, it's catch and release. It doesn't work. And we have not really been filling the gap there the way we did in Iraq. At the height of the surge, and this is something people need to focus on a little more, at the height of the surge in Iraq, we were holding 24,000 detainees in Iraq. And that had a lot to do, I think, with the reason why the surge was successful, because we were taking a lot of bad guys off the streets and putting them in buka. Now, how many detainees are we holding in Afghanistan? I will offer a great prize to anybody who knows the figure. I won't put you on the spot, though. I will tell you the figure. It is 621 detainees. It might be 623, it might be 620, but roughly 621 being held at the theater detainment facility at Bagram, okay? 621 being held in Afghanistan versus 24,000 that were held in Iraq at the height of the surge. Now, I'm not saying that all those 24,000 we were holding should have been held. Some of them were rounded up in sweeps, and maybe holding them actually aggravated people rather than helping the situation. And there's differences between the situations in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the reality is we got to be holding a lot more detainees. We got to take a lot more guerrilla/terrorist fighters off the streets and put them behind bars. And we got to get the authority to do that, which is very hard under the ISAF/NATO mandate, which basically doesn't allow you to do detainee operations at all because the Europeans are running around like a chicken without a head, worried about Guantanamo Bay and other possible abuses. And we just cannot allow ourselves to be paralyzed by that, because you cannot have an effective counterinsurgency strategy unless you're actually taking more of the bad guys off the streets, and we got to be able to do that. So those are, the other thing that I would mention as an area of where we need to work on a little bit is we got to stop bashing Hamid Karzai. Okay, this guy, I don't understand what the Obama administration is doing in publicly attacking our ally in Afghanistan when they don't have any alternative lined up, and the odds are Karzai is going to win re-election in August, and we're going to be stuck with him, and we've been alienating him by bad-mouthing him in public. Big mistake. We shouldn't focus on the individual. Support him in public, beat him up in private, and more than beat him up in private, work with him. Give him the kind of support structure he needs. We've got to really be focusing on building up Afghan governmental capacity and not being obsessed about one guy at the top, because you know what? You could take Karzai out there and you could put Superman in the presidential palace in Kabul, and it's still not going to give Afghanistan a functioning government. You've got to work on building up governmental capacity. You've got to work on mentoring governors and cabinet ministers and the president and others. All these kinds of difficult things that I think we're starting to see the need to do with the civilian surge, but it's going to take time. And that's going to pay, I think, much better dividends than publicly attacking Hamid Karzai, which I think is completely counterproductive. Now, these are all things basically at the margin. As I say, I think we are going to start making, I think the situation is not as bad as it appears from reading the news media. I think we are going to be able to start to make progress with the more troops that are being sent. I think we have a very good chance to turn things around. I think the probability is, in fact, that we will turn things around. You know, we don't have to make Afghanistan, you know, Valhalla. We don't have to make it perfect. We just have to make it better than it is. In fact, if we could just get it back to the levels of violence where it was at in 2002, 2003, that would be pretty darn successful. And I think that is very much within our capability. Now, as I wrap up, let me just say a closing word about Pakistan, because as Steve Cole and others have mentioned, you know, there's been much talk about AFPAC or PACAF or whatever the term is these days. And yeah, there's no question Pakistan is a huge, huge mess, and nobody has any idea what to do about it. But we can't let that stop us from doing what needs to be done in Afghanistan. And we shouldn't exaggerate the level of influence that Pakistan has over Afghanistan. Yes, they make the situation worse, but almost all the insurgents that we face in Afghanistan are Afghanis, not Pakistanis, Arabs, or other outsiders. And much of their financing also comes from internal Afghan sources from the poppy trade. They also, yes, they have bases in Pakistan, but they also have bases in Afghanistan. There's huge areas of the Afghan countryside which we don't control. There's even whole provinces where we don't have any troop presence, so we don't have eyes on it. But there are a lot of Taliban training camps and bases located within Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan. So we're not going to be able to solve the problems of Pakistan in the next 6 to 12 months. But despite that, I think we can continue to make progress in Afghanistan. And best case, in the way that Pakistan has been destabilizing Afghanistan over the last 2 years, perhaps at some point we can actually reverse the momentum, reverse the dynamic. And if we can start to stabilize Afghanistan, maybe that can flow over into the western frontier regions of Pakistan. We can start to stabilize Pakistan as well. I think that's kind of the best case scenario. But I think whether that happens or not, we can make progress. And I think this is a war that is very, very winnable. And I think we are on the right track right now.